welcome back to the room where it happened. I intentionally had to pause there to make sure I didn't say A Fork in Time. So for those of you that are on the A Fork in Time feed, hearing this episode and you're going, what in the world is the room where it happened? Welcome to the other thing that we do. And we merged the feeds here a couple of months back. We put an announcement out about that. But what you're going to hear today is a lot like an A Fork in Time, but it's also different than A Fork in Time. And we'll point out what that is. But I just wanted to stop here at the beginning and say that the other thing I know, and if you know, this is one of those things, somewhere in the world, somebody just enjoyed air violining as a result of this episode hitting their feed. So the person who knows who that's for knows who that's for. And if you don't know, I invite you to join us over our Discord channel, because I'm sure you'll see something about it there. So I have all of the team assembled with the exception of Alexis. So we have Chris, Robert, Dylan, and Eric. I'll make this also as an opportunity to let you know Eric Bond is not gone forever, but he has taken a step back for a while. So it makes it actually a little bit easier on me, and I guess on you, Eric. When I say Eric, I mean the one Eric. I don't have to distinguish between Rush and Bond, but just letting you know that Eric Bond, I'm sure, will come back, but he's taking a little bit of a break. And so if you've missed him or wonder what's going on with Eric, because I didn't make a point of that, I'll also make that point now. And Chris, we also do not have to keep to our normal modes of doing things. You don't even get to say hi to the good people. I get to say hi to the good people today because it's the room where it happened.
I don't care. You do not control the mute button. Hi, good people.
All right. So for those of you that have
same
heard,
feed, same Chris.
Yeah, same Chris. Different title, different artwork, but you get the same Chris. So just to introduce again, for those of you that don't know our format here is the concept of sort of taking off from the tune from the musical Hamilton, where something happens in a room. In that case, it was the dinner table bargain. That was actually our first episode. If you haven't gone back, and by the way, the archives are for free on Patreon. Just if you're ever wondering where to find the archives for that, now those episodes are free over on the Patreon feed. But the concept is we start by looking at an historical room and using that as the launching point into the episode, and then we talk about it. Again, we don't speculate about we may speculate about what ifs, but we're not required to. And we really just talk about this as history. It's because we found ourselves so often getting enveloped in the what actually did happen, and then we had to give the what if, the proper due because of the thing. We said, wouldn't it be neat if we had a place to do that? So that's what we're doing here. So imagine you're going back in time. It's over 50 years now. That's hard to believe. But you're going back to the small office area that would have been adjacent to the Oval Office in the White House. And not just any White House, it's the Nixon White House. And there's Nixon's private secretary, Rosemary Woods, who has been with him forever and a day. She goes all the way back to his days in Congress. She's his private secretary, and she's come with him to the White House, now in his second term. And one of the things that she gets to do, apparently, is transcribe the tapes. And you say tapes of what? Well, tapes of conversations that actually happened in the Oval Office, because we came to understand as a result of Watergate that there was a taping system that recorded what went on inside the inner sanctum, and it was apparently voice activated, so pretty much caught everything. They probably did turn it off, I'm sure, at some points, but there's stuff that got recorded here. And in the process of Watergate, it becomes public knowledge that this taping system exists, and so there's an effort to secure these tapes, and there's all kinds of subpoenas, and Judge Sirica, as I remember as a kid, gets involved in this, and all kinds of other things. But they end up with one of the tapes, a crucial tape, the tape from the weekend after the initial Watergate break-in, and it's missing part of the tape. And the story that we eventually hear is that Rosemary accidentally answered. She didn't accidentally answer the phone, but while answering the phone, she accidentally pushed the pedal that she was using while she was transcribing the tape, and she ended up taping over, I think it's 18 minutes. Does that sound about right? There's an 18. It was referred to, and again, I was a youngster. I was a small kid when this happened, but I remember they kept talking about the 18-minute gap, and what was in the 18-minute gap. And again, it was during a crucial time when Haldeman and Nixon are discussing events post break-in. So the room that go ahead, go Chris.
Either that or the long form version of Alice's Restaurant.
Oh, I'm not even going to touch it. I'm not even going to touch it.
Same Chris.
Name Chris.
Richard Nixon could not, in fact, get anything he wanted.
So that's going to be our intro into discussion of things Watergate and things Nixon. We're going to use that as our thinly veiled room excuse to get into this conversation. And we wanted to get this episode out because this month, actually a couple of days ago from when we're recording now, is the 50th anniversary of the Nixon resignation in 1974. So I'm going to go around here really quick and just get some initial thoughts. Chris, you've already gone out there, so we'll let you keep going. When I say Watergate, when I say Nixon, when I say this whole thing, what pops into the mind of Chris Coppola?
Grocery store, actually. At one point, I went shopping for groceries in the Watergate Hotel. There used to be a Safeway in the basement. But I do kind of want to just recap, because I do know we have, not only do we have international listeners, but we have American listeners that like Watergate is a scandal. Watergate's a hotel. And the Democratic National Committee had offices there. And in the lead up to the 1972 election, there was a break-in at the DNC offices. There were people caught. And basically what we're talking about after these robbers were arrested, what we're talking about this couple of days later is a conversation that the supposition is this is Nixon discussing a relationship between his office, his committee to reelect the president, and this break-in. So this would have been very damaging, and that's the crux of what Watergate is.
And one of the best acronyms ever, CREEP. One of the best acronyms ever, the Committee to Reelect the President. Thanks for clarifying that, Chris. I think we assume that everybody knows the backstory here, but there's a couple of elements to that. Robert, you were alive.
I was alive, and I remember watching Nixon's resignation. Let's see, let me get the math right here. I would have been 7 years old when this occurred.
Yeah.
And so I remember watching the resignation, my parents going, he was a crook, and thinking this was somewhat momentous in history at the time, because I watched it and, saw some of the things before. And honestly, my standout is a former Congresswoman, Barbara Jordan, and her in the hearings during the Watergate hearings, because she was from Houston and she was just a stalwart in the House of Representatives.
Jordan, she was awesome.
I actually can hear her voice right now in my head.
And very distinct voice.
Yeah, and what she is saying is, I think it was 76 that she gave the keynote speech. She said, "I, Barbara Jordan, am a keynote speaker," and when she said that, that was powerful. Those words don't sound incredibly powerful, but when she delivered them and the context they were being delivered in, they were quite there. Yeah, Jordan saw more of the national stage. We were actually talking on a podcast about some of the other senators, Howard Baker being one that comes to mind here, and others as well. Future actors and television stars. I can't think of the actor's name now, but he was on the he was one of the attorneys for the committee. Fred Thompson later became a senator.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Sort of rose to power there, getting a lot of time. Just the idea of televised hearings, taking over the airwaves was a new concept that came along with this. We think of that as being just the norm now with cable news and C-SPAN and other things that were there, but the actually seeing hearings, congressional hearings on network television, was new. That was novel in and of itself. And so a lot of things came out of Watergate. And of course, then we got Gate as the suffix for any scandal for a period of time after that. So that's the long standing there. But Chris, thanks for reminding us. The reason it's called the Watergate scandal is the offices were at the office building portion of the Watergate complex, and they broke in there. And so that's the important thing to set. Dylan, when we say Watergate, what pops into your head?
Entirely too many hours of my constitutional law class devoted to all of the shenanigans that the Supreme Court had to say about immunity and the president. Basically, up until this summer, this was the entire extent of the case law precedent on
Yeah.
exactly how immune is a president for the things that he's immune for.
I was going to say, Dylan, good luck because you got to go retake it now.
No, I'm never doing that again. Yeah, and don't be surprised if for most of this episode I ignore whatever happened, the ruling from this summer, just for the sake of convenient discussion, because there's no way I'm going to be able to flip flop back and forth to explain how what was the norm changed and all of that fun stuff. So we're just going to kind of put a cork in that until we have to open.
Right.
Well, with that will be a. Hopefully, that won't be a rumored happen fork in time circa 2026. Like, hopefully not.
Yeah, we don't know. So, Eric, what do you think when you hear Watergate?
Yeah. So, when I think about Watergate, I think of a show that came out when I was in middle school called The X-Files, and there is a character in X-Files in the first season by the name of Deep Throat. And I thought, well, like, what on earth is this Deep Throat character? And we're a family podcast, and so I will just say my discussions and my research led me to the Watergate scandal, and so that's really how I kind of learned about the Watergate scandal and learned about what the kind of the nuances were. And we learned about a decade later that Mark Felt, who is the acting director and was previously deputy director of the FBI during that time, turned out to be the Deep Throat character who gave Woodward and Bernstein a lot of the leads that they really needed.
Yeah, and they called him Deep Throat, a take on the thing we're not going to mention here, so that we don't get our rating touch.
That's why I said we're a family podcast. Tom.
But because he was providing deep background, he would not go on the record with anything that was here, but would point them in the direction of what they were doing and the investigative journalism that was going on there. Again, also something that was not incredibly absolutely novel before that, but came as a result of this, is this idea of that form of investigative reporting at that level being there. I mean, there had been the Pentagon Papers and what had happened before that, which is a different thing, but also the importance of the media casting light on things, particularly newspapers. That's a whole other thing we'll have to explain to a whole generation, because they have no idea what that really is either. But the cast of characters that sort of play in this are unique. And Nixon is the one that we focus on, but we talked earlier in another episode about President Ford and his role, and the choice to pardon. We've already mentioned here Barbara Jordan and Howard Baker, and we've mentioned others that played a role in the decision for Nixon to actually resign, because Nixon was willing to fight this thing out. They had fought it out in the court about, whether the tapes had to be released and other things that were there. Again, immunity and privilege become the things that, what's privileged for the president, what is the president immune from, were a big part of those decisions. But then there's also the whole thing of what was going on behind the scenes, where members of his own party were coming to him and say, Mr. President, you have to step aside. We can't put the country through this. So you find a Barry Goldwater, for example, that's coming in and having this conversation, convincing Nixon that the thing to do is not fight this, that the thing to do is resign. And for me, the thing that I remember particularly, I was this happened, in 72, comes to light in 73, and then 74, August here is when the resignation is happening. So I am, the ages of 4 to 6. So certainly not politically aware. I knew what the president was. I knew this was something. When I heard Watergate, I thought there was actual physical gate that, there was some water behind or something like that. I was troubled with what was going on with that. But I was also, coming to that awareness of this was something that was bad. Somebody had done something that was bad. I didn't know who and what that meant. So it was interesting to be, aware but not aware. There was an air of innocence that I had there that later, as I came to study this and understand this, is like, oh, that's why that was such a big deal. And so it's all there. So it's 50 years removed. So I said, what was the first thing that pops into your mind? What impact, and I'm going to start with today and then we can work backwards into that. What impact has Watergate had on where we sit today in August of 2024 versus August of 1974? What are the ripples from Watergate that we're still dealing with?
Other than we have to have gate attached to anything that is a perceived scandal, which that just drives me insane.
Yeah, but before that, affair probably had
Yes,
had the XYZ affair, and then later we did have the Iran Contra affair. But originally, Iran Gate is what they wanted to label it.
Teapot Dome scandal.
Yeah.
Yeah, scandal. It's amazing. There's words besides gate that can be used to describe these things.
I think the most lasting problem is this is basically, it had been happening before this, but this is basically the last gasp of the sort of, I guess, era of good feelings between the news and the public and their government. This was basically the last straw that basically, turned the public, instead of, in the 50s and early 60s saying, oh yeah, we trust that the government knows what's best for us and that they have, the American people's best interest at heart. After some of the Johnson, Vietnam War decisions and anti-protest decisions, and then this, basically the people basically turned against any real trust of the government, at least for, the next decade and a half. For the most part, there's a huge streak of distrust that basically we've never quite gotten over because of Watergate.
Yeah,
I would argue this started that massive distrust of government. Well, it didn't start it, but it kick-started it made it mainstream. If you were young in the 60s, 68, Summer of Love, you were allowed to question the government because you're young, you're foolish, or whatever. After Nixon, everyone was allowed to question everything the government did. And from that point forward, we get down the slippery slope where you can't trust the government no matter what era starts with that it really made it mainstream to question everything the government did.
The thing that jumped out at me as I was reading some of the retrospectives and articles and other things this week, it talked about how there was already reform going on to a degree. Some things had already started primarily because of the Vietnam War and the opposition to it, and some of the things that were there. 68 was the last convention, at least on the Democratic side, that functioned the way that conventions used to sort of function. The primary system came into being. But one of the articles that I read was talking about just all the reforms that were going on there. For example, there was reform in the power of committee chairman in Congress. There was a pushback on that. There was, Open Records Act, this idea of opening up the government to where you get access to documents and other things came as a result of this. The church hearings in a couple of years are big when it comes to intelligence and the things that are going on there. And I think we had this conversation when we did the episode on Ford's pardon. Jimmy Carter may eventually run for national office, but his ability to win in 76 is a direct result of being an outsider and being somebody that people are willing to trust because he is such an outsider and has the reputation that he does. And so you see that going on. So, in the 10 years, give or take, I think after Watergate, there were a lot of things that came out of that you might argue were good things in terms of pushing forward reforms or other things that were there. It was also interesting in some of those same articles that I read this week talking about how much of that has been pulled. Campaign finance was the other one. There was a lot about campaign finance because this was, the famous thing that Deep Throat says to Woodrow Bernstein is what? Follow the money. Follow the money. And this was the money that related, to the campaign. And so then you had campaign finance reform. Well, since then, we've had Citizens United and all kinds of things that roll that back. You have a different power exercised by committee chairmen in both houses of Congress. Yes, that's been curbed, but it hasn't. You have more of the direct appeal of those folks, with their committee hearings being, for example, televised. You have, again, this idea that there was a lot of change that came out of that, and then slowly over the next 40 years, it all sort of rolls back. And you could argue that, the government is maybe more open today than it was then, but it's not as open as it may have been 10 years after that, was at least one of the things that I read as I was thinking through. I'm like, that I think that's true, is that it launched some stuff that's all been sort of undone since then. So we went through it, and what did we get for it? Well, maybe not a lot at the end of the day. We just got something different.
Well, and then the other thing is, do you get the idea is for the press now to all the press wants to hit a big hit because of Woodward and Bernstein, because of this. They were really, I'll call it out, they were the first news celebrities to an extent. Other than maybe, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the guy's name. Spanish-American War.
You're thinking Hearst.
Publisher. Hearst.
Hearst, yeah.
But
yeah.
What about Edward R. Murrow?
Yeah,
Walter
Murrow.
Cronkite?
But Cronkite and Murrow towed the line and gave the news. They didn't go investigate. Bernstein and Woodward were the first. There were investigations that had occurred before, but now if you investigate, you become a celebrity, I think, is kind of the.
So the press craved a scandal in a way they did not previously.
Correct.
Yeah.
Do you also kind of see this as, and not to say that Woodward and Bernstein were necessarily partisan in and of themselves,
right?
Because if you look at them today, they're on the opposite side of a lot of things. But do you think this was the beginning of a politicized press?
I think it was the beginning
of
what
the door for the press to be politicized, is how I would say.
Yeah, I think it became
what I think
more
it does,
overt.
it opens up the idea of news wars, because what was going
Yes.
on here was the Washington Post was racing against the New York Times and others, to break this story. And there was question about, do we have enough here to run it? Well, if we don't run it, the Times probably will, or the Times saying if we don't run it, the Post probably will. And there still was a high degree, I think, of journalism ethics that were being used there, about, having multiple sources, corroborating stuff. But even like, the way it's portrayed in All the President's Men, the whole thing of, okay, if it's not true, hang up. And then, the person stays on the line. It's like, okay, I'm gonna, by a negative reinforcement, I'm going to positively affirm something here. How can I do this in a way that still has integrity, but sort of skirts the line there? That was going on as well.
Well, and I think between the Post breaking this and the Pentagon Papers, I think you start seeing a much more, I don't want to say partisan, even though the Post does kind of tend to get seen as sort of a more liberal newspaper. But in terms of, you get sort of pro-administration and anti-administration newspapers, basically, no matter which paper it's going to end up being, depending on who's in office. But you start seeing this like white knight crusader newspaper kind of start happening. It's something that continues to happen, later, especially with like Iran-Contra and some of the stuff in the 90s and all that. But this is the first real time, other than your sort of Murrow-esque kind of.
I mean, I'm also thinking about how many, throughout the country, how many small town papers are called the Arkansas Democrat. Things like, that literally was a thing that definitely happened.
Yeah, and I think this is really the beginning of that. Like I said, I don't think it's the beginning of it happening. I think it's becoming much more overt. It's much more publicly acceptable for these things to be kind of out in the open. In terms of sort of the like I said, it's not out and out partisanship like compared to what some of what we see today, but it's much more being comfortable putting your opinion on your sleeve. It is an opinion. We're not just going to root it in the facts. We're going to actually say, hey, here's what we think is going on. Here is our sort of judgment rendered on the situation, not just this happened at this point and this is who did it, and let the public figure out the rest.
Trying to remember polling data, and I actually meant to look this up on it, but I remember one of the things, my degree's in political science. So I'm in college in the late 80s. So this is post Watergate, but also still close enough to it that the reverberations are still working through. And I can remember in one of my political science courses, one of the things that was being talked about there was the level of distrust of government, as we've already talked about, had gone up. But it was this, do you trust Congress? Do you trust the president? Generally, those numbers had trended much, much higher through Watergate and post Watergate. But there was still this concept of, I don't like Congress, but I like my Congress person. It was this sort of this mental, being able to hold both of those things, cognitive dissonance. That's the word I'm looking for. There was this cognitive dissonance around, I don't like the institution. I don't trust the institution, but I trust my guy or gal. Congress is bad, but my Congress person is okay, kind of thing that was going on in the 80s. And that had come as a result of, I think that I remember seeing the numbers there. One of the things that we looked at, one of the studies, was post Watergate, to the extent that we still, to a degree, have that today, but it just expressed itself in a partisan way. The reason I trust my guy or gal is because they are or not with my party affiliation. And you still have the same nobody likes Congress, for example, kind of thing, which is ironic to me. The reason I bring this up is I remember that thinking at that time, Congress took the hit, but Nixon was president. So it was the whole concept, though, of just government in general being less trustworthy for all the reasons that was there. And it's not like, we're not naive. We know the government was doing all kinds of things before this stuff had light shined on it, but that brought it out into the public domain, which I think was also part of what's different.
Yeah, I pulled up the Pew data, and so Nixon starts with an approval rating in 1968 of 62%. Johnson is the highest one in 1964 at 77%, right after Kennedy's assassination. Nixon starts at 62%. He resigns, it's 36%. The highest it ever gets after that, HW gets up to 46% at one point after the Gulf War, and W gets a 55% in 2001. But other than that, it's averaging below 35% the entire rest of the time since Nixon.
On September 12th, 2001, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the fact that you start seeing, before Nixon resigns, the average government approval rating is like in the high 50s to high 60s, in that sort of 10% bracket. After Nixon resigns, other than a couple of, really iconic, understandable bumps in popularity for various things, public approval of the quote unquote government, basically measured by the president, doesn't go above 45%. Mostly doesn't go above 40%. So this is a huge shift in the public psychology.
Yeah, a majority of Americans, except with rare brief instances, the majority don't approve of the top executive of the government and what they're doing. That becomes the change. Yeah.
Yeah,
Nixon.
and I think you also start seeing this sort of public acknowledgement of the government needing to act against the government, the different parts of the government not sort of being as lockstep as you saw, obviously in World War II, everybody's on the same page. In the 50s, you kind of see some of the fighting over the McCarthy, investigations and things like that. But for the most part, the judiciary, Congress, and the presidency, they're all kind of seen as they're all different teams playing different, defensive and offensive, groups or teams. Like in football, this is a terrible analogy for a guy who doesn't watch football, but this is your offense, your defense, and your special teams, all not necessarily working 100% in sync, but they're all basically running parallel. They're all trying to win the game. Whereas after Nixon, once you start seeing the Justice Department investigate a sitting president and Congress basically say, we're going to hang you out to dry if you don't, take the dignified way out, people start realizing that government, one, is not as trustworthy as it had been, but also is not a sort of monolith. they realize that the disparate parts of government are very much not necessarily always in agreement, nor should they be expected to be. So especially with the Justice Department, you begin to see people realize that this can, not only is it a political event, in the case of the trial of Richard Nixon, but it can be a continuously political tool in the right or wrong hands.
Yeah, and what strikes me there, really, the way you said that, Dylan, popped it into my head in a powerful way. I think you can argue the separation of powers and the structure of the U.S. government going through Watergate, and then the personalities involved. We made references to some of these folks already. It worked. At the end of the day, it actually sort of worked. It took some dysfunction to get there, and it was an ugly, watching it unfold on your TV, as the train wreck in slow motion wasn't fun for the people that were there. But at the end of the day, you can argue that it worked, and it worked because Congress did have hearings, and the Justice Department did actually do things that weren't just at the behest, although there was the Saturday Night Massacre, which was a fun little interesting thing of, I'm going to put somebody in place who will do what I want to do or not want to do at the end of the day. But even that was pushed back on, and there was pushback on that. But I think you can argue the Constitution worked during Watergate, and the personalities involved worked, and yet we still ended up with this odd sort of outcome of not trusting it.
I'd say it largely worked. I kind of think that Ford set a pretty dangerous precedence with the pardon for, basically after all of this, to get, detailed again, because that's kind of what I do. I bring it back to the details. Gerald Ford issued a pardon to Richard Nixon and said, break in, cover up, obstruction of justice. It doesn't matter. You did not commit any crimes in relation to Watergate. Basically, just a blank check. And
as it turns out, Chris, that becomes dangerous 50 years later, because that establishes at least a theoretical precedent for presidential immunity for official actions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I will put the link in this episode to the Fork in Time where recently we covered this and talked about this, because it's relevant to the conversation that we had there. And I know, Dylan, you delivered some fantastic stuff. We were going through that, understanding, you read the actual pardon you on that episode. I remember reading them, and the word choice there is interesting in terms of what Ford is saying and not saying when he does it, right?
Yeah. So for one thing, I think, even putting aside the Supreme Court ruling from this summer, I think the wording of the pardon is a potentially dangerous precedent just in how open-ended it is. For one, you've got the, okay, we pardoned this guy for all of this stuff, but, Ford pardoned him for not just the crimes that he, like I brought up in the other episode, there was a draft indictment. It's got like 18 counts that you can definitively say he probably did these. We can pardon him for these. But also any crimes that he may have committed. That is the incredibly broad, open-ended, really disastrous precedent. And the reason why I say that is because the conversations that started coming up a couple of years ago with a self-pardon or a reflexive pardon, that's when it really becomes dangerous. Is, okay, if the president can pardon somebody not just for specific things that they did, but just a blanket, hey, we know you bombed, we know you threw a bomb into a school bus. We don't exactly know what all crimes that was, but sure, you're fine for the whole thing. That is, I think, really the more dangerous precedent. And also Nixon's whole apology, not apology. I accept the pardon, but it's totally not my fault, but I'm going to be the white knight falling on my sword kind of deal. Also,
and it's not illegal. Literally,
it's not illegal if the president does it.
He accepts it in the green room of the Frost interview where he goes and says it's not illegal if I do it.
Which is even better if you just hear that line in your head, not in Richard Nixon's voice, but in Frank Langella's voice from the movie, because it just makes the whole thing even more absurd than it is in real life.
And I do think, by the way, I think we generally like Gerald Ford on this podcast. He's a nice guy. I think he was wrong in one of his assumptions about the pardon, which was America's been through enough, and I'm doing this to spare America the further trauma of this trial. And I think, where we started out was saying, listen, the checks and balances worked. And I think checks and balances work. They worked up to this point. Let it play out, because that could have strengthened these checks and balances.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Chris. But I think, again, like you say, this podcast generally likes Gerald Ford, and so I would suggest that this was based out of naivete on his part,
listen,
and not
we
corruption.
understand where he's coming from. I don't think it was corrupt. I understand the interpretation of the facts that he, I just think it's a little, and listen, I'd be interested to think, if Gerald Ford could see what has happened because of that, would he still have done it? That's a legit question in my mind.
Well,
Gosh, that's a really good question.
I'd go back to what, and Dylan brought this up. I looked it up again. Ford justified it with Burdick versus the United States.
The a pardon carries an admission of guilt, and so that's what covers the whole thing. Basically, by giving Nixon the pardon, he accepted guilt.
Heart.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, I mean, he carried the opinion around with him in his wallet for the rest of his days. One because when you do something like that, you're going to get called on it, so you've got to have your citation ready. But also, I think, I said it on the other podcast. He is the Boy Scout president. He's a good guy. He's trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. But also, I think he's almost a little naive. I understand where he was coming from in wanting to see the whole event drawn to a close, but in doing that, he was farsighted enough to see what we needed to get past, but he wasn't farsighted enough to see what we needed, and that was to sacrifice the short-term catharsis for the long-term boundary and rule setting, because that's how you get to situations like, and I know we try to minimize being political, but I mean, this is the elephant in the room. This is how you get to situations like January 6th and the opinion from this summer, because when you only have two Supreme Court rulings that are on very precise points of law in a very vague subject, that's like trying to play chess while knowing how the pawn moves and the bishop moves, and everybody else can do whatever the heck they want.
Yeah.
And I think that is the problem with Ford giving the pardon when he gave it.
Well,
or giving the pardon
I agree,
at all.
and it's a really good metaphor, Dylan.
Yeah, that is.
And I wonder what Ford would have done if he would have known that. And there's a part of me that feels that he still would have given a pardon, but it would have been very specifically tailored to those charges that were known at the time, with no assumption that there was any sort of blanket immunity for the president.
Yeah, or him.
Or maybe he wouldn't have done a pardon at all.
Yeah, or even if he had waited until, because this probably would have gone up to the Supreme Court. Just the concept of the Justice Department prosecuting a president. So you can let the Supreme Court make their opinion that lays out the boundaries for how it's supposed to happen. Then you can issue the pardon, and at least you've got the guide rails for the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's doing it
That's
before
true.
you have any kind of guidance that, hindsight 2020 becomes the problem that we still have to deal with today.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dylan.
And two things that flow off of that, Dylan, again, we're referencing that other episode. So if you haven't listened to that other episode, again, the link will be there. I highly encourage you to go back and do it. It's a good companion to the discussion that's here. But, as you pointed out, Nixon didn't have to do what somebody normally has to do to receive the pardon, which is they negotiated this sort of what Nixon released as his statement that sort of, like you said, I did it, but I didn't do it. And, but he still gets the benefit of it without having to take it. At a minimum, what you might have seen a Ford who had the benefit of traveling back in time in hindsight is you're going to get the pardon, but you're actually going to actually admit clearly to what you're being pardoned for. So I don't have to write this sort of vague, whatever you might have done that might have been this, that could have been woulda, coulda, shoulda. It can be more precise. And he would have left himself open to potential other situations which came to light later that probably should have at least been investigated and or prosecuted, but then you couldn't because, again, I think we understand. We said that, we generally say we understand what Ford's on it with. We have to get past this as a nation. This is keeping us from doing other things we need to do, except that he set up the traps for, it basically was kicking the can down the road for some of this stuff is what I heard when you were describing their dealing is, and because this didn't get decided, it didn't get decided. Now we have to decide it. And we only have a couple of precedents that are not even really on point to decide whatever we're doing now based upon, but yet people want to point to those when they do it.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem that I especially have with this is, we're granted we're armchair generaling this whole thing, but when you have situations that are this serious in terms of the fabric of the government and the functioning of the American political apparatus, in order to get to something that explains how the rules are supposed to work, you already kind of are towing across the red line that you don't want to cross. So, there have been a couple of other, between Watergate and now, situations where things might have boiled over to the point where we could have gotten more guidelines, like Iran-Contra, Whitewater, maybe, the Lewinsky scandal, some of the stuff in the aftermath of the invasion in Afghanistan. But the level of problem that you have to get to even approach how does this work? This is kind of a constitutional problem that we have. This is not like a congressman committing bribery. That's bad, but that's like normal bad. That's like, yeah, we know how bribery works. When you have the one of the three legs of the stool of government, basically being made out of balsa wood, you find out, instead of oak, and it turns out that everybody just kind of painted it and went along with it, and now you've got to figure out, once it's cracked, how to fix it.
So, by the way, I want to comment on something that you just did. So there was Ford, there was Carter. Then you named a Reagan scandal, a Clinton scandal, a W. Bush scandal, and I want you to go ahead and try and name those that are happening with that level of frequency leading up to Watergate.
I mean, there's the Gulf of Tonkin.
Okay.
Cambodia.
That was Nixon himself again.
Yeah, and it's kind of the same time.
And by the way, if you want to go back,
and when did Cambodia really hit?
Checkers was campaign finance.
Yeah,
that was no Nixon.
That was back in '52.
Right, but so I think the point I'm getting at is I think presidential scandals are, I think, getting more common.
Oh yeah, very much so. But there's a difference between a presidential scandal that gets a president in hot water just in terms of public opinion, and versus a presidential scandal that becomes a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, and what you just named were a lot of constitutional crises.
Yeah, and that was my point.
Frequency
but my point is that a lot of other stuff in the government, in terms of like, the Constitution may be a little vague on the executive functions of an administrative agency or whatever, like, the head of the EPA has to interpret stuff. That's one thing. But when the boundaries of the president and the limits on prosecution that the president is subject to, there are only so many factual scenarios that are going to rise to the level of severity that will present that. And once you can only have that happen so many times and the dice land the right way. before the dice land the wrong way. And that's what I'm really getting at is it's kind of like atomic warfare. You don't want to play that game too many times, even no matter how confident you are that you're going to win it, because at a certain point you're not, just based on statistics, and nobody wants to be around when that happens.
I learned in 1983 that the only way to win was not to play. So
yeah. Well, and my question is to go back, and I'm gonna have to think, but to get to a level of presidential scandal, Teapot Dome, maybe?
Yeah.
Before Watergate, and then and I'm just wondering, is all of this linked on some level? Because we talked about the more adversarial press.
I would
initial
say, I would
plus
say one of the reasons, at least there's
the
that
pardoning
gap,
of Ford. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
is because after, not long after Teapot Dome is the election of 1932. And you did really have a New Deal consensus. And so you had Republicans that were for a little more pro-business, a little lower tax. But we've talked on this episode about, or talked, on other episodes about like the one Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower. And we've ticked off some things he did, and it sure doesn't sound like a small government person. So I think there was a consensus that started fraying, and when it frayed, that led to the bifurcation of politics into a camp that thinks government can solve the issues, and the kind of people that walk around saying the scariest phrase in the English language is "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." That comes very soon after this. And I think the reason that you don't have, what you were talking about earlier, okay, yeah, my head hurts thinking about the example of offense, defense, and special teams all working together. But I understood what you were doing. The reason they were all working together for this 40, 50-year period between Teapot Dome and this. And by the way, the reason you didn't have these scandals between, let's go ahead and say, like the Grant administration and Teapot Dome is because you had kind of national consensuses. You did not have a lot of power competition. Or when you did have power competition, everybody kind of agreed on some unwritten rules, or we're kind of all going in the same direction, if that makes sense.
And the way that manifested itself, as we talked about, I think that was before we started recording, the way that manifested itself, even in Watergate, was that you had a Howard Baker, constantly, what did the president know and when did he know it? That was a Republican. That was a Republican senator asking of a Republican president in a scandal I want to know, for better or for worse, I want to know what the truth is here. And that's what mattered.
And we've alluded to it, Howard Baker and Barry Goldwater, basically 50 years and a couple of days ago, went to the White House. And the inciting incident for Nixon deciding to resign is when Republican senators came to the White House and said, "You do not have the votes." And now the idea of Republican senators going to a Republican president and saying, "You do not have the votes to stay in office. We are going to vote to impeach you." And those Republican lawmakers having a career after their next election, that's a little bit, that's a big change.
Yeah, and I would argue, I think this is what I said before we started recording too, is that Baker and Goldwater and others went to deliver that message to Nixon that, you can't fight this, you can't win. It's best for you, best for the country, best for you, best for the country, best for the party if you don't. But again, Baker was also not just saying that in closed door meetings in the Oval Office or in the residence. He was saying that on TV during the hearings, and that was a that's not what you see today. Now you see, this is true of both parties, so I'm not making a cut against one part or the other here. You see them circle the wagons around their position, and we've seen a different version of this. I don't want to tie President Biden to a scandal like Watergate, but we saw this for the decision for him to stand down for the nomination, where what was being said in private and what was being said in public were obviously not the same thing in the way that it was being reported out. And the point that I'm making here back in Watergate is that what was different, again, how to some degree how it worked, as dysfunctional as things were. And I love, Dylan, you've done some great analogies here. I have the balsa wood stool now, and I have odd chess sets in my head, so I'm working through that. Helena Nash would be proud of you, by the way, Dylan. That's all I'm going to say.
Don't get too excited. I've used up any good metaphor karma on this episode. Okay. I'm going to be mixing things up for the next 2 years after this.
Yeah, and we'll accept that. We'll still let you come back. But my point is that these things were. It was different then than it is now in terms of how they played out in public versus private, I guess, is my simple point. And again, it wasn't until you were saying some of the things that you said earlier, Dylan, that it really clicked in my head. As dysfunctional and as non-resolute as a lot of this should have been, Monday morning quarterbacking works really well. I know what play I should have called is to pick up on the football analogy, but it actually worked. Congressional hearings led to the point of putting this out in the public space. The Justice Department was not just Nixon's flunkies. They were out there doing what they were doing in terms of moving this forward. Leaders inside of the sitting president's own party came to him and said, this is not something that needs to happen. You have the ability. There was a lot that worked in this process. And the irony of it, to me, this is what really struck me hard here. The irony is it did, and yet still, because of the core thing that caused it, the perception leads to the numbers that you gave, Dylan, about approval ratings and how that represents the faith of the electorate in the U.S. government. Now, part of that was also post-Vietnam and post a lot of other things that came to light. So it's not, I guess my other thing to say, it's not just all on Watergate. It's easy to identify it because Watergate is the big watershed moment in this, but you had a lot of other stuff that had happened before, and you have a lot of stuff that happens after.
It normalized it. Because remember, what did Nixon use to win? The voice of who? The great silent majority. And so it normalized. You didn't have to be a flaming radical hippie, war love child, anti-war love child to think bad about the government anymore. It normalized that thought.
I was going to go this way earlier, and I've enjoyed this so far, but Nixon is the guy at the middle of all of this. And, one of the things I've learned as a result of doing A Fork in Time was his prowess as a poker player, which I didn't know as much about before as I did. Obviously, various things that we've talked about relative to him as Eisenhower's vice president, as, a governor of California, then as president. We have Nixon gone now, and it's been long enough removed that we look back on it. Let's say 100 years from now, where even more time has gone by. Is the first two sentences of anything that goes into a reference document or any reference wording that's not generated by Chat GPT or its successors, is Watergate in the first two sentences again? Or does Nixon actually pick up anything else?
No, it's still Watergate. But I also think that Nixon has, I still think there's going to be a more complex long-term judgment by history.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, I think it really depends on, and not to get all Al Gore after the episode that just came out, but I think it depends on what may happen going forward in terms of climate, just because the other big thing that I can see him being remembered for is founding the EPA, depending on how this goes. Maybe that's,
by the way.
Well, you can regret a lot of things that still end up being good points for humanity. So yeah, he gets the point whether he wants it or not.
And I personally, I don't agree with I don't disagree with the founding of the EPA, but Nixon was a very complex person.
Yeah.
I think once we have a couple more presidents resign, once it gets to the point that he's not the only one that ever actually and he wasn't the only president to ever be, to face an impeachment, but once he has a little bit more company over on that side, I think the nature of who's over there with him will get looked at, because Nixon did do a lot, and Nixon is a very complex politician. And I think the next president to resign, I think, may not have any accomplishments other than
his resignation.
Yeah.
or her resignation, whatever the case might
Yeah.
be.
So my other thought is, I think how our long range relationship and what all happens with China at the end of the day,
That was the thing that was in my head
potentially
too, Robert.
would reflect on Nixon, because only Nixon could go to China and open China.
And it's interesting you say that, Robert, because that was what ran through my head. I think there will be a judgment about Nixon's China policy exists now, and there'll be that will either be reinforced or changed over time, depending on what happens from this point forward. But Nixon from a foreign policy standpoint is just an interesting thing overall. Nixon domestically and Nixon foreign in the foreign arena are interesting, and to the extent that there's the rehabilitation of Richard Nixon that happens while he's still alive, it's the rehabilitation of Nixon in the foreign policy arena, because that's the area that Watergate did not directly touch. That's the area where he's not tarnished as much, if that makes any sense the way I describe it.
It makes perfect sense. And there were two reasons why this happened. One is that Nixon's foreign policy decisions are actually pretty easy to defend. They are, in my opinion, pretty standard American foreign policy at that point. I don't feel like Nixon's foreign policy was particularly controversial in a lot of ways, whether you are more conservative or whether you're more progressive. Number two is that Nixon had Henry Kissinger until last year to continue to rehabilitate
to spin things and to explain things, if nothing else.
Yeah. So he had a spin doctor for another almost 50 years.
Yeah.
So I mean, Nixon had reasons that he was able to be rehabilitated, and I've watched a lot of the videos, and not just in the past 48 hours leading up to this episode. I watched a lot of the episodes from the Nixon library, and the truth is, for all of his faults, Richard Nixon was a keen political mind. He was a very smart man. He had a lot of interesting ideas and a lot of interesting conclusions about both people and policies. You can disagree with it, but you can't dismiss it.
I think that's a good way to describe it.
Yep.
The one thing I would say, and we did an entire episode on this, his role in the 68 peace negotiations crossed every imaginable line. And I almost feel like he was lucky that Watergate is what came out and not that.
The Chinoa, you talk about the Chinoa affair. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But and to Robert's point, the reason they say the reason Nixon was the one who could go to China was because of his staunch bona fides as being an anti-communist.
Yep.
Which, if you look at where those came from, are arguably misguided, in my opinion. But yet they create credibility out of something that might in and of itself be not credible, if that makes any sense in the way that I've just described it. The reason Nixon could go was that nobody was going to call Nixon a communist, right? No. So he had that unique thing.
And you had to have somebody with a combination of those anti-communist bona fides and also the political skill to be able to pull it off.
Yeah.
And so it didn't have to be Nixon necessarily, But in practice, it had to be Nixon.
Right. Because he met the qualifications. He ticked the boxes that you needed to tick at that time to do it. And also, how much of this is him versus how much of this is Kissinger or others that are, that are his advisors, is that he also recognized this idea of the triangulation element with the Soviet Union and what was going on in the Cold War in such a way that, that back to Dylan's thing, that this thing's sort of a tripod in terms of the way that it goes here. What's going to be stable here? Well, you can't let two of the legs dominate too much to keep things balanced, or else you've got something that's out of whack. And, so was it about, opening China? And yes, it was also about China relative to the Soviet Union. It was about Soviet Union relative to China. He was playing chess and not checkers there, to borrow Dylan's analogy as well. He was thinking three-dimensionally and thinking about how the different pieces could move and how you would move them together or prevent them from moving together.
So my question is, did anybody else's head go to my dog checkers? I just
Yep.
When he said checkers,
Yep.
my brain just zapped there. Sorry, couldn't stop it.
But by the way, I'll plant the seed here for now. One of the things I'm going to put in the AFIT queue while we're talking about American officials potentially assassinated on foreign soil, we did that here recently, is the recognition that Nixon almost loses his life in '58 in Colombia while he's on a quote unquote goodwill tour. And how that could have played out a little bit differently. We wouldn't have Nixon to kick around because Nixon wouldn't be around to kick around.
And Mary Rose was actually wounded during that. She got hit by glass.
Yeah, she got hit by glass. There's another interesting fork that we could have out of all this too. If we can keep J. Edgar Hoover alive for another couple of years, Watergate may not be a thing.
Because he wouldn't have been using amateurs to break into the Watergate. He'd have been using the FBI. Would have been doing his dirty work.
Yeah, exactly.
Doing his dirty work for him.
By the way,
we don't need to keep J. Edgar Hoover alive any longer than he was already alive.
I don't like the idea. It's just an interesting discussion. The other one we could do is imagine Nixon never bluffs a lieutenant in the Pacific in World War II to get the money to run for Congress. That's a little more.
I actually think this is an interesting thing about, parties changing their lineups. What if Eisenhower drops Nixon because of checkers in '52?
Yeah, I think we actually covered that at least tangentially on that episode. It's amazing, as we talk about in this episode and that episode, it's amazing how much Richard Nixon weaves his way through because of what's going on here from World War II, I want a poker game, I have some money, therefore I can run for Congress, all the way through to I'm the first president ever to resign. He got a lot done.
I also feel like there's something to be said for that New Deal consensus timeframe I was talking about being really our wheelhouse. Everybody here being really comfortable with that. And yeah.
Well, and we do still have to figure out, if we decide at some point, to do an episode where Nixon's not in the picture, we do have to think about who the president in a jar is going to be on Futurama if it's not going to be Nixon. I just want to put that out there. We've got to figure that's going to have to be in the episode somewhere.
And actually,
who's going to be Reagan?
Yeah, and who's actually going to be the line from going in a different direction here? From I'm thinking about Sleeper with Woody Allen. He's in the future and they're asking him questions about, and Nixon comes up and he gives some different answers about reality than what Nixon was as well. So the Nixon ripples are wide and big in all kinds of places.
One last small ripple, and because of Nixon, Nicolas Cage could break into the White House at the Easter egg roll and hit the Resolute desk up to get his plank.
So there you go. So it's all about national. At the end of the day, it's all about national treasure.
Nixon was using the Wilson desk, which is in the Senate, which Carter changed back to the Resolute desk afterwards. So I saw that just as a trivia and went, "That's interesting."
Those are some of my favorite bad movies.
The first one much more than the second one.
Yeah, that's true. But I will say that's a movie. I'll try it out and watch those movies with my kids probably every year around the holidays.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put Eric on the spot here for a second because I know some feelings he has on this. So
Yeah.
of those two presidents using that desk, Wilson and Nixon.
Ooh.
Oh yeah.
Ooh.
Oh, you're so mean.
Well, because we were just talking about how do we evaluate Nixon's role, and let's.
To be fair, I do have to make a point about Wilson. At least I feel like Nixon would edge out in terms of the desk usage only because of Wilson's stroke. So we have to give some of Wilson's credit to Edith.
And by the way, I'll go ahead and say
I mean, I might have a different opinion if it were Edith, and so like I will say, in 1912, I would have voted Bull Moose.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I will go ahead and say this.
No, like, I'm serious.
No, but evaluating these two presidents, I think Nixon is a better president. Just so you know, based on
Chris,
his...
I actually agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you, and I wouldn't say would I have voted for Nixon in 1968, and I don't know that I would have.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think I would have been really torn. Would I have voted for him in 1972?
But
against McGovern, I'm pretty sure I would have.
But by the way, let's bring a weird Futurama reference. 1968, the election is between Nixon and Wilson's head in a jar.
I'm more concerned about how they got Wilson's head in the jar. Like, if this is 1960s technology, this is some weird MK Ultra CIA stuff going on.
You know,
or they figured out how to the fluoride in the water that they've just started using secretly has acid in it across the whole country.
I'm not a tribe guy. I'm a policy guy,
mm-hmm.
and at the end of the day, I'm sorry. I think Nixon was, Watergate aside, Nixon was a better president than Wilson was.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's the last place I wanted to close out, and because we jumped the shark here about 5 minutes ago, but that's okay.
I think we jumped several sharks.
Yeah. And sadly, I'm actually of the age that I remember the airing of that Happy Days episode that even references. That puts me in a category there. But let's again, we don't do the what if here, but I'm inclined to play the what if. We've sort of done that a little bit here. If Watergate never comes to light, so we don't have Nixon's resignation. And we were suddenly now talking about, 2 years from now, the 50th anniversary of him leaving office a different way. Is it an incredibly different conversation that we have around Nixon, or is it still
Absolutely.
probably is it still probably,
Yep.
To your point, Eric, he's this complicated persona that's hard to understand.
Yeah, Nixon is viewed as having a fundamentally successful presidency. He is thought to be ultimately successful, but I also think that there is a different progression for the Republican Party, because after Nixon, and especially after the loss in '76 with Carter, there was a lot of soul searching with the Republican Party, and the solution they came up with is Reagan. And that was a successful solution. With a successful Nixon pregnancy, oh my God, what is going on?
Because remember, in '72, Nixon won 49 states.
He won everything but Massachusetts and DC.
Correct.
He lost 16 electoral votes?
Yeah.
He had 60.7% of the popular vote.
It was very successful.
Yep.
And so in light of that, I think you have a very different idea of what it means to be a successful Republican candidate.
And you may or may not have, I think we may have talked about that, you may or may not have Ford winning a 4-year term in 76, but then, you have the inevitable thing we always talk about here. The pendulum's going to swing after 12 years then of Republicans. By the time you get to 1980 and other things, it probably swings back in the other direction. But
And you get Kennedy.
but
You
with
don't
different,
get Carter.
yeah.
No, you get Ted Kennedy. I was
Yeah.
just thinking the same thing, Robert.
And the other thing that, that strikes me here, because I do heavily correlate the Carter presidency with being a Watergate aided phenomena. I think we all pretty much agree with that. And so one of the things you get, and again, we don't do the what if here, but I just asked the what if question. You don't get what I think is arguably the most incredible post presidency that existed. You don't have a Jimmy Carter to do what he did there in such a way that we look and go, what can it look like after you leave the office? Because what we actually got from Nixon, because of the way that he left, or even Nixon the way that he would have left otherwise, you don't have a Carter. It just changes. That may be a small thing, but to me, that's a big thing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in Carter, you had the antidotes, or the attempted antidote to Nixon and to Watergate, is you picked a person who was on it, who was so decent, and that he belied all of the trauma that happened there. And as it turns out, he just wasn't prepared to be the politician that he needed to be successful in that presidency.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about a non-Watergate stained Nixon?
I would say I'm not sure about Reagan not happening, just because he is surging. There is still the Goldwater people. There is still a reaction to, the New Deal consensus that I keep talking about, of, all the stuff that Nixon actually signed. So I'm not sure that doesn't come about. We're just talking no Watergate, or are we talking no Church Commission, no all of these things that came out during his presidency?
No,
Watergate,
I think it's just no Watergate, but Reagan surged in 76.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that he would have had, would he have been present in the conversation in 76 anyway?
Mm-hmm.
Probably. Would he have had the influence that he had? No.
But the one thing I think that does happen, I could easily see a Reagan happening and getting impeached over Iran-Contra. I think one of the things.
So let me paint this for you, Chris.
Yeah.
You see Kennedy in 80. Let's say Kennedy in 80.
I actually think Kennedy in 76.
Okay.
If that's an open spot, yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's an open spot. So it's kind of like 2000. So a sitting vice president runs. So Ford runs against Kennedy, loses in 76. Kennedy's reelected in 80. Reagan wins in 84 as a reaction to whatever happens. And there's plenty that could have happened in an 8-year Kennedy administration. So.
Or a 4. I'm not convinced that it's an 8, but
okay, yeah. So fair enough. So, but it's somehow, some way, and there's actually a pretty good podcast on the Iran-Contra affair if anybody's interested. Not this one, although we could do that one later. I could easily see a Reagan who does not come to power with quite the mandate that he did in our timeline, and that in the first term has becomes involved in the Iran-Contra affair.
Again, the same thing happens, because the one thing the thing that I think a lot of people felt around Iran-Contra was that, gee, we just did this. And it's not like, let's not go through this again. And I think one of the big things around the Clinton impeachment is, well, they did it to a Republican, let's get them back. And I'm troubled that maybe that dam broke and now you're going to have trading impeachments.
Yeah, I mean, the bar definitely seems to be a lot lower now.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question of that. At least the threat of impeachment. For things that, and I'm not blaming one side in particular. I'm just saying, impeachment for things that are not high crimes and misdemeanors, for things that are policy disagreements.
Yeah, which brings things actually around full circle to where we started with this and the precedent that it sets about what are the boundaries for legitimate actions by a president that are immune or not immune from prosecution, or that have to be done through an impeachment process. Or, to me, I'll make this political statement because this is just where I sit. And I think, again, anybody who's listening to this podcast and or knows me in real life knows that I think of myself as a moderate that has leanings in both directions on different things, but both parties deserve to be painted for where we are now. I'll leave it at that. But what I will say that is around that is this concept of we have politicized things that didn't need to be politicized in the way that you just described there, Eric. This is a policy thing, and we're going to impeach you over a policy thing because we have difficulty now figuring out where these lines ought to be that were never properly drawn in the original document because they were not imagined in the way that we've imagined them, and they've never been adjudicated in a way that lets you know where they sit now as well. So we're in no man's land when it comes to this.
And this is just such a great reason to bring Bo back on for the Living Constitution.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Because, even in the past, we talked about this when we did the episode, and then Dylan's already alluded to, I'm going to look at what was 50 years ago because I can't even figured out what happened here in the last 50 days, kind of deal in terms of where that's at, is we're now trying to interpret and apply a document that's getting really, really old. It's almost 250 years old now. That's not the document, but the things that lead to the document. We're moving towards that here rapidly.
And there's a difference between, I think we all have a sense that the Constitution is sacred in some way. And I don't even disagree with that. Like I feel that as an American in a lot of ways. But there's a difference between something being sacred and something being immutable. And I think we need to understand the difference between those two. And that the Constitution, we may see it sacred, not because of the document itself, but because of because of what that means in the contract amongst us as Americans. That the contract amongst us as country people is sacred.
Yeah.
But the document itself can be changed.
And arguably how this ties back to the topic today is that Watergate stressed all of that.
It did.
And
Yes.
and we as a nation found a way to navigate through it. Maybe not the best way. Again, hindsight's always being 20/20, but we found a way through it. And we continue to struggle with the same things that put it under stress then. And we're probably having more difficulty figuring out how to do it now than they had even in 74.
Yeah.
And that's, we also recognize we have a global audience here. In fact, some of our most vocal audience participants on our Discord server are not Americans, which I love. So I think they look at these discussions we have around this and we say we and us, and they know what we mean by that and they respect that. But it's, we have a unique, I just used it again. There's a unique American perspective on this that it's very difficult, I think, for us at times to step back and see from either the perspective of history, which is what we're looking here 50 years back. What does it mean? Or stepping outside of it today to say, what does this look like from the outside? We have a difficult time doing that because we're on the inside. It's just hard to do. Yeah. And you have two ways of dealing with that. And hopefully we do that with some integrity on both our shows, is we either do it by looking back and thinking that through from the other perspective. That's what we do with the alternate things. Or we look at it like this, where we try to step outside and say, okay, putting our own feelings aside, what is the broader understanding of this? And some of these things are just hard to understand. The thing that I've learned as I get older is I get less resolute in what I think is certain, which is ironic. I think because a lot of people go in the other direction the older they get. I open up a little bit more too. I'm not quite as sure that that's as black and white as I thought it was, kind of thing. And for me, Watergate has hit that point. Yeah, I see all elements inside of this. And again, I don't want to belabor the point, but I'll say it again. I see heroic figures that are the footnote figures inside of Watergate. We focus on Nixon or we focus on Ford, but I've mentioned him so many times here. A little love to Howard Baker. A little love to the Supreme Court that was navigating through some of these decisions, Dylan. I think they probably took on some of this better than the current court. I'll go there in terms of trying to think these issues through.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
they dealt with two major cases against a sitting president in 8 months. I mean, that's never happened ever in the history of the country. So, say what you will about the Supreme Court now, but I think they carried the football as best they could at the time, even if we may have some disagreements about it now.
Yeah,
and we have.
I'll allow that analogy. That football analogy.
I told you they were going to go downhill. I ran out of good ones. I'm just running on fumes now.
and we had a Congress that was willing to put country over party.
Yeah,
in large part, and to try to speak some truth. And we've had some discussions in the past about Barry Goldwater, and they haven't been very flattering. And yet he was still one of those senators who told Nixon at the end of the day, Mr. President, you do not have the votes. He was honest about that. And
well,
I can't help.
No, go ahead, Eric.
Well, I can't help but think that was part of Nixon's decision, is because he had people that were so unimpeachable, forgive the word, but so impeachable in their commitment to the party and to the party's principles.
Almost that Nixon is the only one that could go to China. Goldwater is the only one that could go to the White House.
Yeah,
potentially. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, if you're in that role, like if Barry Goldwater tells you you're done, and you're Republican, you're done.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that popped into my head there as you were saying that, Eric, and I think you make an excellent point there, is that it also speaks to the pragmatic, realpolitik Nixon, who definitely was an ideologue in a lot of ways, no doubt about that. But here's the guy that's looking, okay, at the end of the day, it's about the votes. And if I don't have the votes, I don't have the votes. What am I going to do about that?
And Nixon was an ideologue in terms of a particular global view in foreign policy.
Right.
I don't think he was an ideologue in a lot of other ways. I think he was very willing to listen to go with the trend. I think he was very willing in domestic policy to a point, and to see where the wind's blowing.
Well, and I think, to go back to, to kind of this discussion of sort of, what we think of this versus what some of the, our listeners, from other countries may think of this. And going back to some of the points that we brought up kind of right at the beginning, Watergate seems like it was the diverging point of, the political community in the United States. I mean, the political community of Washington, D.C., the people that are in and of the government. Chris, unless you're a congressman, sorry, you technically don't count for what I mean.
I live outside the Beltway. I live like 3 miles from the Beltway.
But this seems like it's kind of the diverging point between, when at the time in the late 60s and early 70s, politicians understood both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And they at least they weren't necessarily in lockstep, but there was at least overlap in the Venn diagram. Whereas, especially nowadays, and it seems like to some extent it's been getting worse ever since. there's an understanding of what the letter of the law is, and the spirit of the law is completely divorced from the recognition of, oh, the letter of the law says this, even though in spirit it's really meant towards something else. And I look through the we talk about how we're so obsessed with this Constitution that is getting more and more ancient. And just out of curiosity, I looked up when the last constitutional amendment was, just out of curiosity to see how ancient this really is. So the 27th Amendment was enacted in 1992. So it has been 32 years since the last constitutional amendment. And I would argue this is kind of where I'm going. The 27th Amendment was proposed in 1789. So I would argue it doesn't even count in terms of the how ancient the document is conversation. So we really haven't had the last major substantive constitutional amendment period was 1971. So since Watergate, we have kind of been frozen in this. Basically, Watergate kind of paralyzed our understanding of the spirit and the letter of the Constitution and the political environment of the United States. And I wonder if that is part of the problem in terms of how we see and deal with today.
It's a symptom of the problem.
Okay.
Because I would argue that the framers of the Constitution made an amendment very hard to do.
Yeah. You
do need to have a significant majority of the country in agreement that we need to do this. The fact that the Constitution hasn't been changed is a symptom of the polarization of society, so that you can't come together and agree on some of these things. That's the argument I would make. That it's a symptom of it. It's not, we have discussed one of the big things, one of the big reforms of the War Powers Act. Big reforms of this era, War Powers Act, in relation to the Gulf of Tonkin, and like putting in codifying who gets to, blow things up. I mean, that's very important, and that's a huge gray area.
To your point, Eric, we need to reach out to Bo and ask him to come back and enlighten us a little bit. It's been long enough, and I'd be curious.
Yeah.
I'd also be curious to know, honestly, if he'd be willing to. And I don't know if he still listens or not. Maybe, hopefully, he does. But I would love to know, even since he wrote the book, because of the events of the last couple of years, how that would inform his thinking. I'd be really curious to know what that is, because again, one of the things we talked about there, the idea of generational constitutions, is a process by which you constantly, do what you do there. And, now would be I don't think we could have one now that wouldn't blow us up, is my thinking on this. There's no possible way, even if it were built in to do it, that you were supposed to do it every now and again. We couldn't do it now.
And I mean, I think you have, if you were to have it again, if you were to have it recently, you'd have nothing come out of it. You'd have the exact same Constitution as you had going into it. I don't think that would, because that's what we've had.
Right. And I think it was Dylan or you, whoever made the point that we're sort of frozen as a result of Watergate, which is the point. Guys, I've enjoyed this. We could and would go on if we didn't have to sleep and have real jobs for longer, because I know we enjoy talking about this. This is what we do, and this is why we sort of created this as a different place. We're not bound. We talked about a lot of what ifs here, but we're not bound by the what ifs, and we're able to go. So on behalf of Chris and Eric and Dylan and Robert, this is Don saying we really appreciate you joining us for this room where it happened. When you hear the violin music in the theme song that's different, just know that there's a listener out there that likes to air violin when he hears it. So we also had to get one out, if for no other reason than that. And we certainly want to recognize this significant anniversary of a significant event in American history and what it meant. Next week on the feed, we'll be back to the regularly scheduled programming, so to speak, which is a fork in time. But we'll be mixing in more and more of the room where it happened as you go. And again, if you haven't heard this format before, because we're now in the fork in time feed, you can visit our Patreon page, and I'll put a link in the show notes as well. All of the archived episodes of the room, and this is room number, drum roll please, I think this is going to be room number 11, if I remember correctly, when we're done here. This is room number 11. There's 10 more rooms that you can go back and listen to, and you can hear that format as it goes. So we just also encourage our listeners to check out our website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com, Discord server, all the usual stuff we talk about on an episode about how to interact with us, and encourage you to do that. So on behalf of the team here, we say thank you for giving us an extended period of your time here. We appreciate that. That's the other thing about this format. We go longer, and we look forward to talking to you soon. And if you happen on something that's interesting to think about, this is not just a fork, but something to think about, shoot us a note. We may talk about it soon. Thanks.